Okay. Now in this class, I'm presenting the historical case for the resurrection of Christ. And as I said last week, by that I mean in making the case for his resurrection, I will not rely on the inspiration or the inerrancy of the Bible. Rather, I'll treat the New Testament documents like any other ancient writings that have historical content. And I do that. I want you and anybody who may be interested to appreciate that one need not start from a belief in the inspiration of the Bible to conclude that Jesus was in fact raised from the dead. Now, last week I summarily disposed of two claims that you may run into, you, your children, your grandchildren, somebody may run into. The first is this idea that Jesus never existed, and the second is that he didn't die by crucifixion. Virtually all scholars in all of the disciplines of ancient history agree that these are not serious questions. Jesus did indeed live, and he did die by crucifixion under the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. And last week I also explained the views of death and the afterlife that existed at the time of Christ. And we saw that the pagans, they had two views. You had the view that some held that when you die, you simply went out of existence, your existence terminated. Whereas most pagans believed that when you died, you continued to live in a disembodied state. Your soul or spirit continued to exist. They saw death as a one-way street to a disembodied existence. In other words, no pagans believed in resurrection. The idea that the dead would, after a time, return to bodily life. And those same two views you see reflected among Jews. You had some, like the Sadducees, who believed that one's existence was extinguished at death. And you had some Jews, like the philosopher Philo, who believed that the dead continued to exist as a disembodied soul or spirit without any future resurrection. But most Jews in the first century believed that God would raise people to immortal bodily life at the last day, the day on which God judged and remade the world. And Jesus agreed that there would be a general resurrection of the dead at the beginning of the eternal state. But with hindsight, we understand that Jesus also made clear that he would be raised to immortal bodily life in history, prior to the time God judges and remakes the world. As Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15, 20 to 23, Christ is the first fruits of the resurrection. As the first fruits of agricultural products serve as a guarantee of a coming full harvest, the resurrection of Christ signifies that more resurrections are coming. That's what first fruits is about. And the end-time resurrection, it's part of. It's one piece with Christ's resurrection. It's all the same harvest. So Paul says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 14, "For we believe that Jesus died and rose again, and so we believe that God will bring with Jesus those who've fallen asleep." Now, as I said last week, resurrection of an individual prior to the end time, that was not part of the Jewish theological landscape. And for that reason, the disciples at that time, they didn't understand what Jesus meant when he spoke of his rising from the dead. They didn't expect him to be resurrected, and that's significant to appreciate. They didn't expect him to be resurrected as epitomized by Cleopas's despairing statement in Luke chapter 24, verse 21, and by their initial unwillingness to believe that Jesus had been resurrected. All right, so that's kind of a recap of what I said last week. Now, the historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection. The first point in the historical case for Jesus' resurrection is that the disciples sincerely believed Jesus had been resurrected. They were certain of it. They sincerely believed that. And yes, I understand that sincerely believing something need not mean that the belief is true. I understand that. But if you will stick with me, you will see, I believe, the significance of the fact they sincerely believe it. So I'm going to pound on this, the historical evidence that lets you see how clearly we can understand that they sincerely believed he was raised from the dead. We can know that they sincerely believe that. We can know that from, there are several lines of evidence, several different lines of evidence. In the first place, the disciples claimed that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to them. You say, well, how do you know that? How do you know that these first disciples claimed that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to them? Well, we know they claim that because we have multiple early and independent sources that make that clear. As a historian, that's what you're looking for. You're looking for multiple early independent sources when you're trying to determine a state of fact. And so that's what we have here. First, we have Paul's testimony that he saw the resurrected Jesus. We have the actual words of Paul from the horse's mouth. Paul saying he saw the resurrected Christ. He says so in 1 Corinthians 9:1. He says it in 1 Corinthians 15:8. And he says it less clearly in Galatians 1:12 and 1:16. Now, both of those letters, 1 Corinthians and Galatians, are among the 7 undisputed Pauline letters. I'm convinced all of the letters are from Paul. Ephesians, Colossians, 2 Thessalonians, all of them are from Paul. There's good evidence for believing that. But for some, there is scholarly debate about it. Of these 7, virtually all scholars accept and acknowledge they were written by Paul. So 1 Corinthians and Galatians, where Paul says, I saw the raised Lord, the risen Lord. We know this is from Paul himself. These are Paul's words. And 1 Corinthians was written just about 25 years after Jesus' death. That's if you date his death around AD 30, which is what I think, but there are some who think it's AD 33. Well, if it's AD 33, then it's even less than 25 years after his death. And Galatians is written only 18 to 20 years after Jesus' death, although some people would date Galatians into the mid-50s, but I think more likely into the late 40s. Now, Christ's appearance, you say, so here we have Paul saying, out of the horse's mouth, undisputed Pauline letter, Paul is saying, I saw the risen Lord. And then not only that, but Christ's appearance to Paul is corroborated by Luke in the book of Acts. We have Luke saying, here's what Paul experienced. This is Paul's testimony. I know this. You say, well, what do I care about Luke? Why do I think that Luke has any connection with Paul, that he's in any position to be able to convey to me any reliable information about what Paul experienced, what Paul believed, what Paul claimed? Why do I think that about Luke? Well, we know that Luke was a companion of Paul's. You say, well, how do you know Luke was a companion of Paul? Because Luke wrote the book of Acts, and in Acts you have in these famous we passages, where Luke will say they, and then he'll say we. Okay, so you see that the author of Acts, Luke, was with the people at certain points in the journeys. So we know he was a companion of Paul's, and we also know it because Paul mentions him in several letters, in Colossians 4:14, 2 Timothy 4:11. Now some people say, well, it's debatable whether Paul wrote Colossians or 2 Timothy. It's not about Philemon, is it? And he mentions him in Philemon also. Now note that Luke's accounts, they don't suggest something other than an actual appearance of Jesus to Paul. On the contrary, Luke says in Acts 9:7 that Paul's fellow travelers did not see anyone. When he says that, there's an implied contrast with Paul. He saw what his companions did not. They didn't see anything, but Paul did. And in Acts 9:17, Luke reports Ananias' comment to Paul about Jesus having appeared to him on the road. In 9:27, he reports that Barnabas explained to the apostles how Paul had seen the Lord, who spoke to him. And in Acts 26:16, he reports Paul's reference to Jesus' statement that he appeared to Paul. So the onset of Paul's blindness in the Damascus Road experience ought not be put so early as to deny this visual element that is acknowledged in Acts, and Paul makes a centerpiece in 1 Corinthians of the experience. Now, let me say a little footnote here about the Damascus Road experience. The description of that experience in Acts chapter 26, verse 19, as a heavenly vision. That's how it's described there. The description of that Damascus Road experience as a heavenly vision in Acts 26:19 does not mean that it was a purely subjective, quote, seeing of a non-material thing. The following question and answer, I think, is instructive in that regard. It's an interview of the New Testament scholar, by New Testament scholar Ben Witherington. He's interviewing, this is in March 2009, he was interviewing N.T. Wright regarding Wright's 2008 book, Surprised by Hope. And Witherington says, there seem to have been at least two persons who saw the risen Jesus on or after Easter who were not amongst his disciples at the time. James, his brother, and Saul on Damascus Road. One of these surely took place during the initial period of appearances, the other after those 40 or so days, which is to say after the ascension of Christ to heaven. Yet they both claimed equally to have seen the risen Lord. In your view, was either of these appearances to non-disciples visionary in character? And does it make any difference to your case that resurrection always meant something that happened to a body after death and the initial afterlife? Wright responds, he says, James, Paul, visions. The difficulty here is that in our culture, a vision is thought of as a purely subjective thing, so that when people say so-and-so had a vision, they assume there is no correlated phenomena in our own space-time matter world. The whole New Testament is predicated on a different view, that heaven and earth are twin parts of God's good creation and that they overlap and interlock in a variety of surprising ways, so that sometimes people really do see right into God's dimension, and sometimes aspects of God's dimension, in this case the risen body of Jesus, are visible from within our dimension. That is, of course, what I think was happening when Paul saw Jesus, as I've explained in the relevant chapter of the resurrection of the Son of God. That's Wright's book. Such moments are genuine anticipations of the final day when heaven and earth will come together as one glorious reality, when the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Our culture's built on the denial that such a thing is possible, let alone desirable, so things fall apart into either ordinary seeing or vision, the first being objective, the latter subjective. To unravel this further would need a few paragraphs on epistemology. So I want you to see this is a big footnote, but I want you to see that when what Paul sees, he's seeing the risen Lord. He sees him, it is an appearance. And the fact it's referred to as a vision there does not mean he's not seeing something, an objective phenomena. For example, the two men, just to show you this point, the two men in dazzling apparel who stood before the women and spoke to them in Luke chapter 24, verses 4 to 7. They were an external manifestation. They were angels who were, or who at least appeared to the women to be, physically present. All the women were frightened by what they saw, and they bowed their faces to the ground. I mean, even the Roman guards. In Matthew's account, in Matthew chapter 28, verses 2 to 4, they reacted to the angel's presence, trembling and becoming as dead men. And according to the disciples on the road to Emmaus, the women described this shared, objective experience as having seen a vision of angels. The very same word used in Acts 26:19. Having seen a vision of angels. And the same goes for the angel of the Lord, whom Zechariah saw and spoke with in Luke 1:11 to 20. That's described as a vision in chapter 1, verse 22 of Luke. So clearly a vision can be an objective perception of an external phenomenon. Okay, so just don't, I say that because sometimes people will try to say, well, Paul didn't see, and no, he did. See, he saw the risen Lord. Now, for Paul, it involves seeing the resurrected Christ. So when you say, well, what evidence do you have that they sincerely believe this? Well, we have a number of lines of evidence. The first line of evidence is that they claimed that Jesus was raised from the dead and appeared to them. What evidence do you have that they claimed that? Well, first is Paul's testimony that he saw the risen Lord. And then we have Paul's repeated testimony, his firsthand, out of the horse's mouth, in numerous undisputed letters, that he believed and preached that Jesus was raised from the dead. This is all over the place. When you look, you start in Romans, all right? From the resurrection of the dead, raised Jesus our Lord from the dead, raised from the dead, raised from the dead, raised from the dead, raised Jesus from the dead, that was raised up, 10:9, raised him from the dead, lived again, raised on the third day. This is just Romans, and then in 1 Corinthians 15:4, you go to 1 Corinthians 15:12 to 20. Raised from the dead, been raised, raised Christ, been raised, been raised. He carries on. 2 Corinthians, raised the Lord Jesus, was raised. Galatians, raised him. Philippians, his resurrection. Philippians, body of his glory. 1 Thessalonians, raised from the dead. 1 Thessalonians, rose again. I mean, you say, did they sincerely believe this? Well, he says he appeared to me, and then all in his first-hand writings, he's saying Jesus rose from the dead. So he believed it, right? He's saying this, he's making this clear. He says it. And then we have this corroborated by Luke. Luke, in his accounts of what does Paul speak of? What does Paul say? How does he teach? What is his preaching? So Paul tells us in his first-hand account, Jesus rose from the dead. And then we have Luke saying, I hear Paul preaching, and guess what he's preaching? Jesus rose from the dead. So I have what Paul says there. It is corroborated by Luke in Acts 13, 16, 17, 25, 26. So this is some good historical evidence. And Paul clearly knew the other apostles personally. He knew them personally, and we have his first-hand report in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 1 to 11, which is a letter that was intended to be read publicly while the apostles were living. It's written in the mid-50s to the church in Corinth, intended to be read publicly while the apostles are living. And he says there that those apostles, he knows them personally. He writes to the church in Corinth, and he says that those apostles preach the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. You see, Christ died, was buried, was raised on the third day. I'm the least of the apostles, whether I or they. thus we preach. So he says that the other apostles, this is what they preach. And we also have his firsthand report in Galatians chapter 2, verses 1 to 9, which is another letter that's intended to be read publicly in the congregation during the lifetime of the apostles. And he says here that those apostles agreed with the gospel that Paul preached, which gospel we know includes the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. We know that from 1 Corinthians 15, 1 to 5. And when I say that he's saying this to these people to be read there during the lives of the apostles, now do you think if he's saying that they agree with me, somebody there's not going to say, hey, Paul's over here talking trash. Paul's saying, you're saying you're down with what he's saying. Now, what's that about? I mean, the Christian community's connected. And so, of course, he's saying that with no fear of contradiction at all. So it's evidence that they too understood this. They too believed this. Now, I say that Paul clearly knew the other apostles personally. He said, you kind of assumed that. You said that, but you didn't show me that. Well, I say it because we have firsthand statements. In Galatians chapter 1, verses 18 and 19, Galatians chapter 2, 1 to 10, that he knew the other apostles and the gospel that they preached. So we have out of the horse's mouth, first-hand statements. And then Luke, who's a companion of Paul, he confirms that Paul was acquainted with the other apostles and the gospel that they preached. So we've got a ton of evidence. Right then, contemporary, great evidence that Paul, yes, in fact, Paul knows these apostles and what they preach. And Paul declares in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 5, again in a letter to be read publicly in the Corinthian congregation, which congregation we know was personally acquainted with Peter. We know that from 1 Corinthians 1:12, 3:22, 9:5. The church in Corinth was personally acquainted with Peter. Paul writes a letter to them, and he says in a letter to be read in that congregation that the raised Christ was seen by Peter. Now, like I say, if Paul is saying this, don't you think somebody in Corinth who says, oh, it'd be like somebody writes to your home congregation. Let's say you're from somewhere else and somebody writes to your home congregation. And they say, yeah, this is what's going on. Word's going to get back, right? I mean, somebody can say, what's this I'm hearing about you seeing a dead guy? What is that about? You see, so if it weren't true, it's just crazy to think he would say something like that. Or, that Peter understood that. Peter had said that. And so you see that corroborated there. The resurrected Christ not only appeared to Peter, but also to the 12. Now, for several reasons, Paul's statement in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 to 5, it's generally recognized as an early creedal formula. Okay, for a number of reasons, but it's generally recognized. Now, a creed is simply a set way, a formalized way of expressing certain important truths, usually in a way that facilitates memorization. Now, Paul, he says in 1 Corinthians 15:3 that he previously had passed on or delivered to the Corinthians the elements of this creed. So he's writing them in the mid-50s. And he says in what he writes to them that this creed, that Christ died for our sins, was raised on the third day, was seen by Peter and the 12, that this he had passed on to them earlier. And he's referring to when he had gone to Corinth 4 years before that. So we're back around 51. But he also indicates that he himself had received the creed that he passed on to them earlier. He himself had received it earlier than that. Okay, so we're at least within 20 years of the death of Christ, probably within 6 or 7 years, when Paul first went and met with the leaders of the church in Jerusalem, as you see in Acts 9, probably within 6 or 7 years, but certainly within 20 years of Christ's death, there is already a creedal formula circulating that proclaims his resurrection. It proclaims he was killed, raised on the third day, and was seen by Peter and the 12. As one scholar noted, he said, this is the sort of data historians of antiquity drool over. Okay, do you see how close this is? First-hand, close stuff? 6 or 7 years? We've got a creed that's circulating in the community that he was resurrected and was seen by Peter and the 12. Well, that's pretty powerful evidence that they sincerely believed that Jesus had been raised from the dead and appeared to them. Now, when you say, all right, you see the disciples believed this. Well, what's the first line of evidence that they believed it? Well, they claimed, they said, they proclaimed, they declared that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to them. And the first line of evidence shoring that up or showing that is Paul's testimony. But the second is the 4 Gospels. Now, the authors of each of the 4 Gospels report that Jesus rose from the dead, and with the possible exception of Mark, depending on how one treats Mark 16, verses 9 to 20. With the possible exception of Mark, they all report appearances to the disciples. So the Gospels say he rose from the dead, and they report that he appeared to the disciples, and there are very good reasons for believing that those Gospel accounts, the testimony in those Gospels, go back to the early disciples, go back to the first disciples, that they are faithful expressions of the stories that those first disciples told. So at the very least, they are good evidence of what the early Christians claimed regarding Christ's resurrection. I got to say a little bit about the Gospels, because if you're going to appeal to the Gospels, why should I think they have any historical credibility? Okay, remember, we're not relying on, you and I know, the Bible's inspired, the Bible's inerrant. So I don't have to, for you, I can just say, see, the Bible says that, and you go, amen. Okay, but I want you to see you don't have to first go there to reach this conclusion. So somebody says the Gospels, why should I think that they have any historical credibility at all? Why should I think that they in fact reflect the teaching of the first disciples, what they claimed about Jesus? Well, there are good reasons for that when you talk about their reliability generally. And the first thing to note when you're assessing the general reliability of the Gospels is that, contrary to the popular assertion that you hear everywhere, that the Gospels were originally anonymous, or nobody knew who wrote these things. They were originally anonymous, and it was only much later, way down the road, 2nd century, only later were they attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Well, there are very good reasons to believe that that's baloney. Excellent reasons to believe that that's baloney. There's good reason to believe that the 4 Gospels were in fact written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. This is significant, right? Because Matthew and John, they're apostles. So if we're talking about why should I believe there's any historical reliability in these documents, well, if Matthew and John are writing them, they're apostles, and Mark and Luke were companions of apostles. So they would be in great position to give us reliable testimony, right? About what they believed, what they claimed about the resurrection of Christ. Now, I say there's very good reason for believing that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the Gospels. Because listen to this, not a single anonymous copy of any gospel has ever been found. Not a single anonymous copy of any gospel has ever been found. All the manuscripts that have been discovered, not only the earliest and the best manuscripts, but all the ancient manuscripts in every language and without exception attribute the four Gospels to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The earliest Greek manuscripts for Matthew and John go back to the 2nd century. The earliest manuscripts for Luke go back to the 2nd or 3rd century. The earliest manuscripts for Mark go back to the 4th century. Now, if the Gospels originally were anonymous, and copies of these anonymous Gospels circulated throughout the Roman Empire for decades, okay, nobody identified as the author, and here they're going out and they're being copied in the churches, being sent everywhere for decades. Now, if that happened, don't you think there would be some kind of manuscript trail of the original form? Don't you think somewhere that there would be a manuscript trail that shows no author? Well, you would think that. You would certainly think you're not going to snuff out all. We've got all of this web of copies that are going out, being copied. And then in the 2nd century, they get attributed to somebody. And then all of a sudden, we can't find a trace of these anonymous things. Does that make sense? That strikes me as crazy. I'm not buying that. And in addition, if the Gospels, if they were originally anonymous and the titles were added to them in the 2nd century, wouldn't you expect that there would be some degree of disagreement regarding the titles? I mean, they're all anonymous. They're circulated all over the empire anonymously. And then in the 2nd century, people start deciding, well, I think I will attribute this writing to this guy. Okay. Now, why would you think that a scribe in Palestine or in Egypt is going to attribute a writing to the same person that the scribe in Rome does? It just seems crazy. You're naturally going to get some level of disagreement about who wrote it. So then you'd have manuscripts. Oh, well, this says the Gospel of Matthew. Well, here, this one says it's the Gospel of Peter. You see, same gospel, but somebody's attributed it to Peter and somebody's attributed it to Matthew. That seems inevitable if they were circulating anonymously. And only in the 2nd century does somebody say, hey, I think I'm going to stick a name on this. You would have disagreement, but you find none of that. You have none of that. Moreover, we know from Luke's gospel that you had many accounts of the life of Jesus were circulating at the time. We know Luke tells us that. So there was a need to distinguish one account from another. I mean, in that environment, it just seems highly doubtful that the four Gospels would have been written without any indication of their authorship. You've got all of these different Gospels, and I'm just going to sail one out there anonymously. So nobody will have a way of referring to it. Nobody will know how it is. Nobody will know how it's distinguished. That just seems to me counterintuitive. I just don't think that's how people would operate. And finally, the earliest Christian writings outside. So when we're talking about internal evidence, we're talking about the manuscript evidence. But when you look at external evidence, the evidence outside of the manuscripts themselves, when we look at the writings outside the New Testament, they are unambiguous and they are unanimous regarding the authorship of the Gospels. Unambiguous and unanimous. Brent Petrie, in his book, The Case for Jesus, the Biblical and Historical Evidence for Christ, Petrie says, to sum up what we've learned so far, when the earliest Christian writings outside the New Testament are taken into account, there's not the slightest trace of external evidence to support the now popular claim that the four Gospels were originally anonymous. As far as we know, for almost 400 years after the lifetime of Jesus, no one, Orthodox or heretic, pagan or Christian, seems to have raised any serious doubts about who wrote the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. As we have seen previously, there was some debate among the church fathers about the exact order and dating of the Gospels, but there was no debate about their authorship. In other words, the theory of anonymous Gospels not only fails to do justice to the internal evidence from the most ancient manuscripts, it also fails to do justice to the external evidence from the earliest Christian writing outside the New Testament. Okay, so when you're talking about we have Paul's testimony, then I also want you to see that we have the testimony of the Gospels. And you say, why should I treat the Gospels as having any historical reliability, as being historically credible? And I'm trying to get you to see there are very good reasons for believing that, because we have very good reasons to say they were written by apostles and companions of apostles. But even if one rejects the authorship of the Gospels, okay, let's say that you say, well, I'm just not buying it. I'm going to stick with the idea they're anonymous, and in the 2nd century, somebody just had this guy gets zapped over here. Yeah, this is Mark's gospel. Way down over here, yeah, this is Mark's gospel. Okay? Even if you want to buy that, all the gospels were written according to most liberal dating estimates. Doesn't mean there aren't outliers, but most, even liberals, date the gospels between 40 to 70 years after the events. Between the Gospels, between 40 to 70 years after the events they record, with Mark generally being considered the earliest. Okay, so the authors of these works certainly were in a position to transmit reliable history. If I am publishing something within 40 to 70 years of the events, there are all kinds of people living who will check me. I can't just come out and start saying stuff that's nonsense, because some guy be sitting there going, what? What do you say it happened? No, I was there. No, you got that all wrong. This guy's a clown. And he get called out. Be shamed. A liar. Okay, so it exercises some control over that. Paul Eddy and Gregory Boyd, they write in their book, The Jesus Legend, a case for the historical reliability of the synoptic Jesus tradition. They say, from what we know about the reliability patterns of orally transmitted traditions, this 40 to 70 years that even liberals accept, most liberals accept as the dating of the Gospels, he says this actually is a rather insignificant span of time, one that technically speaking puts us in touch with oral history rather than oral tradition per se. A broad range of studies from ancient Greece to 19th century Serbo-Croatia to contemporary Africa have all confirmed that orally oriented historical traditions, both oral and written in medium, of relatively recent events within roughly 80 to 150 years of the event recorded tend to be quite reliable. I mean, after all, like I said, the stories are circulating. You see why that would be. The stories are circulating during the lifetimes of the apostles and the other witnesses who certainly would have exercised control on the content. You can't freeform when there are people around who know what happened. Yeah, Peter was doing this, you know. Peter brought a star down to earth. People going, no, he didn't. So you see that, you have that now. In fact, there's been something of a quiet revolution in New Testament studies over the last 20 years or so, led most notably by Samuel Bierskog and Richard Bauckham, in which the assumption of critical scholars over the last century or so, the assumptions they made about how the gospel stories circulated and how they were preserved prior to being written down, it's being overthrown in favor of a greater role for eyewitnesses. In other words, that eyewitness testimony is much more important than scholarship has historically allowed. They shaped this. For example, Richard Bauckham is an internationally respected New Testament scholar. He outlines the objective of his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, the Gospels as Eyewitness Testimony. And Bauckham says, in general, I shall be arguing in this book that the gospel texts are much closer to the form in which the eyewitnesses told their stories or passed on their traditions than is commonly envisaged in current scholarship. This is what gives the Gospels their character as testimony. They embody the testimony of the eyewitnesses. Not, of course, without editing and interpretation, but in a way that is substantially faithful to how the eyewitnesses themselves told it, since the evangelists were in more or less direct contact with eyewitnesses, not removed from them by a long process of anonymous transmission of the traditions. You see, that's the idea that skeptics say, well, no, you can't know. This stuff just went on and on and on and on, and got so detached from everybody, and then people are just free-forming and making junk up. Okay, but that's not the case. That's not the case. Eddy and Boyd, they conclude their survey of the recent work in this field this way. In conclusion, given that the first century Jewish world of pre-gospel oral Jesus tradition highly valued eyewitness testimony, we find it far more plausible that the early church valued and preserved the essence of the personal remembrances of Jesus' original disciples than that they neglected the actual eyewitnesses only to manufacture fabricated testimonies at a later date. At the very least, we can now conclude that the standard form-critical arguments against the presence of a significant amount of eyewitness testimony within the oral Jesus tradition are deeply flawed. So this idea, I heard that bell. So this idea that somehow we just got disconnected from it's just junk. It's just junk. These Gospels are great historical evidence. Okay? And I'll have more to say about that, Lord willing.